Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion. As been very aptly introduced by Anthony. What we're going to do now is Femi is going to start with some opening thoughts, and then we'll start our conversation. And then at a certain point, we will get to the Q&A. So get your questions in there as they occur to you, and we'll come to them later. So for now, over to you, Femi. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alex. First, I would like to thank Anthony and the team at the Philosopher for their interest in what I do and for today's event in particular. And I'm especially grateful to you, Alex, for accepting to lead this conversation. I would like to think that reading the book has not been a waste of your time.
Not at all.
If it has offered any insight to you, that is a bonus, and I'll take it. But seriously, and this goes to the rest of our audience, I'm forever conscious of how much we all strive to manage our time. So when you all decided to spend this next hour with us on this occasion, I really want to appreciate the commitment that you have made to us. And I hope that what follows partly rewards your time. So thank you very much. I did not plan to write this book, but I'm glad that I wrote it. Once I began to research the essay on which the book is based, it became clear to me that something was profoundly amiss. I followed my research, and this is where it led. Given its ubiquity, the ease with which people deploy the decolonization trope, as I call it, I decided that it must be that the idea packs quite an extraordinary explanatory punch, or it is a theory that explains everything, which means it does not explain anything. And the more I dug, the more convinced I became that there is a fundamental conceptual model at the base of decolonization discourse at the present time. And that is a failure to make a distinction that I think is very important between two senses of decolonization. The first, I think, is very simple, very straightforward, and as I like to say, it has an end date. And that is decolonization, that refers to the struggle for independence by various colonial countries. Now, this is another wrinkle in the debate. When I say various colonial countries, usually that comes with the next phrase, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. But once you frame it that way, then you have actually made colonialism a very, very recent phenomenon, and a phenomenon that is actually not applicable, quote unquote, globally. So the way I take it is that a lot of what I read in the colonization discourse does not talk about Japanese colonialism, for instance. Okay, does not talk about British colonialism that gave birth to the country that I'm speaking from, because and this is something that I have addressed in the past in a previous book. And the opening question, or the first chapter of that book, was the following: what do the following countries have in common? And I listed the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Nigeria, South Africa, India. They are all ex-colonies. So which means that at some point or the other, they all underwent this first understanding of decolonization. Now, that's what I call Decolonization Subscript 1 in the book. And then, as I was reading and doing the research and all that, I find that people now think that decolonization is something that carries over to the period after independence. And that what has happened is that because there are many parts, areas of life, many usages, institutions, processes, and practices that now subsist in post-independence, qualities hark too much back to what they regard as colonial, phenomena. So that is now the decolonization that they want to happen. So that's why people now talk about decolonizing literature, decolonizing language, decolonizing religion, decolonizing boiling water. You can name it, there's a decolonizing essay for it right now. Now, that second idea of decolonization as a cultural trope designed to remove the impact, the effects of colonialism in all these other areas that I've mentioned. That is the decolonization that I think we should get rid of yesterday. And the reason why I think we should get rid of it yesterday is because, one, it really does not explain much, if it explains anything. Two, it is now built on another set of confusions. So I always ask, for you to decolonize, there must be colonialism. So if you are decolonizing after independence, it means colonialism never ended. I'm a philosopher, so please pardon me these conceptual niceties. So, and if colonialism continued, then what is the purpose of saying that these countries are now independent? Then people throw at me, oh yes, it just translated into neocolonialism. As a result of doing this work, I've actually gone back to reread Kwame Nkrumah, that people attribute, the origins of neocolonialism and so on to. But I was actually apprised of another African thinker who had a completely different idea of what neocolonialism is. And I will quote him because I have it right in front of me. And it says, the struggle against voluntary subservience and submission to neocolonialism is yet to begin. Our frequent and unabating declamation against neocolonialism appears to me to be pretentious exercise and deliberate diversion. For the true and real neocolonialists are no other than we Africans ourselves. It is we, in spite of our political independence and sovereignty, who voluntarily submit to economic and sometimes diplomatic dominance from outside our borders. So I went back to reread Kwame Nkrumah, and Kwame Nkrumah also says something very similar. It says they are going to try to come back under a different guise. So we got to be on the lookout so that we don't fall into that snare, which means what happens post-independence now rests solidly on the agency of the ex-colonized. And it is how they deploy that agency that will determine how much of what used to be there that they fought against persists and why. So the argument essentially is, if you see phenomena in the post-independence period that mirror what used to happen under colonialism, please don't jump to the conclusion that colonialism is the explanation for why it is there. So it could be there for reasons of inertia. It could be there because the ex-colonized decided, you know what, we can use this, so we're keeping it. And what happens is that for many decolonizers, those of us who take that position, oh, this is really very good, so we're going to keep it, we are called colonized still. We are suffering from colonial mentality. And that's what I mean by, if you take African agencies seriously, that agency will sometimes express itself in ways that will just make your jaw drop. But to that extent, you must hold Africans responsible for the choices they make. The alternative is you accept what the racists have always said, that Africans are permanent children and their will is always under the control of other people who are smarter than they are. There's no midway between those two. And my argument is that let us now look at why some of these things have persisted and let us have specific explanations for them without this global highfalutin, everything is colonial, business. I think that would be a good summary of what I'm trying to do.
Thank you very much for that. And I should begin by saying, of course, reading your book was in no way anything other than a joy and not at all a waste of my time. I suppose I'm going to ask you some questions, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm really an interloper.
Oh, no, that's
in lots
good.
of ways.
That's why I'm so glad you're doing it.
Yeah, I suppose I want to ask some questions to understand a bit more kind of what you're doing, why you're doing it now, and kind of what the stakes are of kind of making this argument. And I'm struck by what you said just now, that you didn't plan to write that book. I wondered, what book did you plan to write?
Definitely not. Actually, as I said in the book, I called this book my friend's book because he was the one who said to me, there's a book here. Okay, I really wasn't thinking of writing, but the reason why this becomes very important for me is that now I look, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, somebody called me from Germany and said, please, we're looking for somebody from the continent who can contribute a chapter in the history of philosophy, on the medieval philosophy, or early modern Euro-American philosophy. And I started calling around. I couldn't find anybody. And the person said, we don't want anybody from South Africa. And I understood why they are saying that, okay? Because a good part of what has happened in the last 2 decades is that many of our young scholars, just the way it happened here under deconstruction, have now been socialized into thinking that they don't need to read those people. And what
the history of kind of European philosophy, you mean?
Exactly. Okay, and that the history, we should really study Africa, and all that. But I study Africa, so you're not going to be able to say that, So that's the first part. The second part, and the more important part, is that all across Africa right now, as in other parts of the world, with the possible exception of Eswatini, okay, every country in Africa is trying to find a way to put in place a modern political system based precisely on some version or the other of liberal representative democracy. And our scholars are nowhere to be found in terms of studying the philosophical foundations of this system. And the continent is awash in NGOs that are funded mostly from here about individual rights, about people owning themselves, all those things that we associate with some of the core tenets of modernity.
So I think maybe here it's useful to step back and think for a second, and to kind of unpack a bit the intellectual and kind of political climate that you're responding to here, because it seems to me in listening to you, so you're writing back to a particular kind of use of the term decolonization, and that is a kind of use of that term that you, I mean, correct me if I've misunderstood here, but that you're kind of associating with an insistence on kind of claims of cultural authenticity, false claims, or to kind of a sort of essentialism. Is this what you mean?
Yes.
Okay, and so then you respond to that by saying, okay, we need to delimit the kind of scope of this term decolonization and make it much smaller.
No, we should get rid of it, because whatever it is doing,
we should get rid of it.
Whatever it is doing, we can do in other areas. We can do with other things and do better. Okay,
right. Well, maybe we'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But just stick with this. Okay, so you make this distinction between decolonization 1 and decolonization 2.
Yes.
And could you kind of say again what those two are, just so, because I think that's a really important kind of.
Decolonization 1 is what people want to call flag independence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Flag independence.
Yeah. Decolonization 2 is when people say, where are the fruits of independence? we're still poor, we're still oppressed, we're still being exploited. Colonization never ended. And then when we look at our culture in our schools, we're still speaking the colonizers' language. We're still going to school in the colonizers', knowledge systems. We are still writing books, in the colonizers' language, and all that. So please, let's decolonize by taking the colonizers' cultural artifacts out of our lives and do life in our language, in our culture, in our music, and all that.
Okay. And okay, so that's really interesting. And I suppose the other kind of context that I have in my mind, I mean, you're in the US and I'm in the UK, and there's also this kind of discussion about decolonizing as a verb, I suppose, that goes on in universities. And I'm interested to hear a bit what you think about that, but maybe that sounds not like exactly where your beginning focus is, but so we could come to that in a second. But I wonder if you could sort of position yourself a little bit for us in terms of thinking about decolonization up to now. So do you see yourself and the proposals that you're making in this book as a kind of in a tradition of sort of thinking about decolonization, or do you see yourself as making a break? I mean, you want to sort of jettison the term, but you draw on a lot of, I suppose, kind of familiar characters from a sort of anti-colonial body of work. You talk about Cabral, you talk about Ngugi, you talk about a lot of these. So are you writing, are you kind of trying to make a break? Are you trying to take that kind of tradition of writing forward?
Okay. There is a difference between Ngugi and Cabral, let's say, on language. Okay. And that distinction actually goes right to the heart of what I'm trying to do. Cabral wrote, he said, probably the biggest gift that we got from the Portuguese is the Portuguese language. And he said that, before then he said, and they had stolen so much from us, if not everything. But the reason why he said that, Portuguese is the language, for him, is that he says, language is just a means of communication. And whatever language enables you to get across what you want to communicate, that's the language you use. And he said, at this moment, we cannot teach the theory of gravity to our children in Creole. It does not mean that we stop working on making Creole capable of doing that down the road. But we're not going to wait until that time before we teach our children the theory of gravity. And it says it's an existential emergency to teach children the theory of gravity. Okay. That's not the position of Ngugi.
So then maybe you could sort of tell us how you characterize Ngugi.
Ngugi's point is that language is not just a means of communication. It is also an embodiment of culture. And it goes right to the heart of defining who we are as a people, as individuals, so that when we are forced to operate in the language of another, that creates literally an inauthentic self. And that is the legacy of colonialism. And until we are able to rid ourselves of that, and that's why it says that, if it's African literature, it has to be in an African language. You don't find Cabral saying something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. Kind of characterize Cabral as a pragmatist in that sense in your book, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But I suppose thinking in my own work in Cabral, one of the things that has kind of struck me is this kind of bifurcated approach, where on the one hand he is a pragmatist and uses Portuguese as a language to speak across kind of to different kind of constituencies of people. But I suppose, for example, in the schools that he set up, the PAIGC, Cabral's party, set up in Guinea and in Conakry during the kind of independence struggle, they did, though make a point of teaching their children as much as possible in Creole. And so that he wasn't disavowing the importance of language as a kind of part of culture.
No, but that's what I'm saying, that but it does not say that if you are not writing in Creole, you are not a Guinean. Yeah.
And so maybe you, and so just to be clear here, what's your position in this? So one of the chapters in this book is all about this kind of language question, and you talk about these debates and Ngugi and Amilcar Cabral, and so what's your intervention there? Where would you say that your kind of position is?
Oh, my position is that, again, it comes back to agency. English did not come to many parts of West Africa as part of colonialism. A Nigerian professor put together an anthology of writings titled, Writings in English in the African World from 1769. So you mean that Africans have been using English since that time? Let's just take that cut-off date. And they haven't done anything to make it their own? I'm sorry.
So yeah, no, that's useful. So your argument there is that Europhone languages can become African and have become African languages too. This is the kind of the interventions. Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to, that's really fascinating. I think you've put it really clearly. I suppose I still want to sort of hear you a little bit more on this kind of on the way you think of yourself. So you said, okay, you quite rightly corrected me that this is a plural tradition, so you can't just be taking it forward or not taking it forward vis-a-vis Cabral or Ngugi. But then in terms of the kind of distinction that you then want to make between a sort of between these two forms of decolonization, these two senses of the word, between flag waving and a kind of, more culturalist and kind of ongoing sense of decolonizing. It seems to me that's quite different maneuver to the maneuvers made by both Ngugi and Cabral, for example, but also Fanon and others who try and think culture and politics together in a way that certainly in the kind of mid 20th century and afterwards seemed to be itself quite capacious and kind of useful for making arguments about the kind of plurality of forms of power on which colonialism relied. And so in delimiting your concept, I kind of want to hear a little bit more about why this is so important to you to make these kind of narrower concepts. Maybe this is a philosophy thing, maybe I'm asking kind of but why do it?
No, I think that people misread Fanon on this point. The entire chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness was precisely to warn us against any kind of tribalizing of our choices. No, when people use Fanon, as a bad certificate for the kind of decolonizing that I'm dumping on, it's just wrong. Fanon, that's why he then, started talking about Senghor, about all those people who think that, there's an Africa that everybody buys into, with their drums, and so on. And he caricatured them in the book. So where do people find this evidence, that Fanon, wants this kind of decolonizing after independence? After independence, what Fanon said is, don't let us be afraid, of realizing that man, to use his language, that Europe discovered but did not have the courage to realize. Fanon was not asking us to get some African man. No. And he was very clear, both in Black Skin, White Masks and in Wretched of the Earth and in other essays, that he was not going to line up behind any kind of authenticity.
Yeah. I think you're right. I agree completely. And I think that it's true that Fanon in particular is kind of taken up as a kind of shorthand in ways that are very simplifying of a lot of the time. But I suppose what I would also kind of draw attention to in Fanon's work are two things that I think, I just want to hear how they kind of speak to your work. The first thing is, I think that for Fanon, decolonization was much more than a flag waving project, first of all, partly because he was not that interested in nationalism as an endpoint. and saw nationalism as a transitional phase to kind of broader forms of political community. But secondly, because it seems to me, in making the distinction that you're making between national independence and kind of, as I've kind of paraphrased it, I'm simplifying what you're saying, kind of a culturalist kind of understanding of decolonization, it seems to me that those two things are very closely connected in Fanon, and that for Fanon, decolonization is also about, well, in his terms, the kind of the making of new selves, of making of new men, to use his terms. And and those two things, I mean, this is in Wretched of the Earth, those two things are very closely connected. And that's why I'm interested to hear from, whether this is something that you're leaving this behind.
No, because Fanon does not allow us to circumscribe the basket of choices, the basket of alternatives on which we can choose the elements of this new human. Okay, the elements will include some from the colonial period, some from the colonizer's culture, some from the colonizer's usages. That is not what current discourses about decolonization, that is not what they say.
Yeah. Okay, so that you come back to this point about kind of cultural, the kind of disavowal of cultural purity.
The second element of that, for Fanon, is that at that point, it's no longer a colonial problem. You see, that's the reason why I made the point in the book that when Fanon said, "the first shall be last," he never bought into the idea, and neither the colonized people, and that's why I use the example of chattel slavery. They never accepted that they were non-human. They never accepted that they were in the zone of non-being. And the world, the Manichaean world of colonialism, Fanon said, we cannot take it as a true description of the reality, because every day, the reality was completely different from the lies that the colonizers were telling about themselves. So the business of becoming human is not something that is new, because they never stopped being human. But it's saying that that framework in which the colonized were understood as being non-human ended with colonialism. Because now they can be in a position to direct their own affairs. If it turns out badly as it has been in Africa, that's the responsibility of Africans.
I think your book is very clear on this point, that the risk of continuing these kind of Manichaean divisions that is present in certain forms of kind of decolonial discourse. I want to ask you, I'm kind of conscious of time, and I think there are quite a lot of questions coming through. I kind of want to ask you a question about the context of the university, and maybe about philosophy that you're making this kind of argument into. Do you see this book as aimed as kind of emerging from philosophy, or aimed at philosophers, or is it something that sort of how important is the philosophy context to you as a philosopher?
No, I don't care about philosophy, frankly. I don't do disciplines.
You heard it here first.
I know. I don't do disciplines. I write what I like, and if it's useful to a military scientist, I'm glad to serve them. Okay, but the foundations of the systems that Africa is trying right now to domesticate are principally philosophical.
Can you say a bit more about what you mean by that?
The foundations of the political systems that Africa is trying strenuously right now to domesticate are principally philosophical, and it's modernity. So how on earth are we going to read the tea leaves right if we don't have a very solid education in the templates from which they are grown?
I said one last question, but on that point, your previous work, you've written a lot about modernity, and we've touched on this before, but I wonder if you could just say how this work kind of emerges out of that previous intervention.
As I said in the preface, it was not until I was completing the book that it came back to me that the elephant in the room again is modernity. When people throw modernity together with colonialism, even though I've written a whole book to say that in some parts of West Africa, modernity came through Christianity and was prosecuted by Africans. Again, talking about agency. And colonialism preempted, their project. And we are still suffering from that preemption up till now. So if you're going to have liberal democracy, where are you going to study it? The Japanese did not say that, they got liberal democracy in their long history. So when the Americans handed them their constitution, they ran with it, and we know where Japan is now. The South Koreans did exactly the same thing. It was handed to them by an American general. They ran with it. And now we go to South Korea to beg for arms.
On this modernity front, I think I'm going to have to take us to the Q&A. Okay, so modernity, as we're all aware, is one of these kind of flag concepts also of kind of the body of thinking that goes by the name decolonial. There are a number of questions in this chat about how you see that Latin American body of thought associated with Quijano and Mignolo and others. So there are different questions on this. I mean, I'll put them both to you and you can kind of decide what you want to answer. So one person has asked, how should the work that how should your work be situated in relationship to that that body of work? Is decoloniality a stronger alternative? So you can think about that. I have a sense of where you're going to go with that. And then the second question related to that is someone has asked, could you speak about what you describe as the conflation of modernity and coloniality in the works of Quijano and Mignolo and their African disciples, who construct African epistemologies mainly through Enlightenment rationality? So yeah, I suppose the question there for you is, how do you situate your own work in relationship to kind of decolonial thinking?
I don't touch it. I know it, but I don't touch it. Maybe when I grow up, I will understand exactly what they're talking about, and I might be able to say something useful about it. And the reason why I put it, and I refrain from discussing it in the book, and Africans, we have a penchant for always jumping on bandwagons,
I'm not sure that's only.
Well, I read people, okay? When you ask people, to describe to you what decoloniality is, when they apply it to, feminism, to, literature, it happened with postmodernism. I was there. It happened with deconstruction. I was there. And that's the reason why I usually just stay away. So I try to, as I said in the book, the sky is big enough for all birds to fly without touching wings. So if people read the junk that I write and it educates them and they want to argue with it, my job is done. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to remind everybody also that your questions will only come through to us if you post them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. So if you've posted a question in the chat and then can you post it again in the Q&A box? That would be really helpful. Okay, another question for you. Thank you very much. I totally agree with your argument and think it's absolutely crucial. I have two questions. This is a really interesting question. What would you say to those critics who would argue that the very idea of agency is itself a colonial legacy, relying as it does on a Western or European idea of subjectivity? And then the second question is to do with how decolonization is taken up and deployed by Hindu nationalists against Muslims in India. And they argue, this person is an anonymous question, but thank you for your question. They argue that basically, what's your position on this kind of take up of decolonization by states, and in particular by Modi's Hindu nationalist state in India?
For all those who persuaded themselves to think that modernity, secularism, and all those things are white, European, and colonial, they can see now in the degradation from the Nehru inheritance to the Modi present. Okay? I do not believe that ideas belong to any people. If I am willing and able to go to a Buddhist monastery and I'm accepted and invest my time and life to become a monk, I become a part owner of that tradition. So if it is human, it does not belong to any human. All those who are willing to do what it takes to appropriate it become part owners of it. That's the first part. So to that extent, I don't want to go over the previous books that I've written, but people can actually, and I hope I'm not being arrogant, they can read the book and then decide, because the argument that I make is that modernity may have originated in Europe. It was not fully constituted there. One of the principal philosophers of modernity, Hegel himself, was very clear that Europe never became aware of itself as Europe until it came to the Americas. So a whole lot of the retrojection, that decolonizers, I think ignorantly, now want to make, into that history, is not supported by, by the history. You just read it. Hegel did not say that, Europe already was constituted. No, they came here and it's like, oh, we are different. We have these people, and then they started manufacturing all those things, So the second thing is that, again, talking about agency, I'm not sure that subjectivity, ideas, and so on and so forth, I can't even say they run in our veins because our veins are the same. So this is precisely why I've written the book. All these ideas that, modernity is European, agency is European, and somebody just told me yesterday, a Nigerian teacher actually said that African cultures don't do rationality. That's a scholar from Niger. I'm sorry. A Nigerian philosopher wrote not too long ago, he said, oh, in my culture, we have only 3 colors. That's what anthropologists used to say. That's what our philosophers are writing now, some of them.
Okay, and a reminder that people should read the book and should make up their own ideas, and it is available for reading. There are loads more questions coming in. I don't know if we're going to get through to them. This is really great. Someone's asking here, I'm interested in what Prof. Táíwò said about Decolonization 1 having an end date. I wonder if you could comment further on the end date in relation to ongoing colonial projects, for instance, in Palestine, Western Sahara, Kurdistan, Tibet, etc. It's not necessarily to ask about those cases, but whether he can comment on the idea that colonialism is not just a historical event, but a form of global power that exists in different forms, and not just and that persists today. I wonder what you think of that.
This is part of my problem why I don't touch coloniality. Okay, you cannot turn colonialism into an ontology that frames being. Then we can never get out of it. How on earth are we going to know when we are beyond the colonial if being is colonial, almost by definition?
I suppose the question there is not so much about being, but about ongoing political projects of imperialism.
But you see, my point is that we should take colonialism and localize it and see how it is. There's only one colonial problem in Africa today, and that's Western Sahara. And it involves Morocco, another African country. So, where's the issue?
So, for example, in the case of Palestine, you wouldn't describe that as a colonial situation.
Oh no, it's a colonial situation, but I'm not talking with it because it's settler colonialism, with all the, and that is an ongoing colonial project, that people are fighting against and all that. And I don't have any problem with that. When I talk about end date, I'm talking specifically about Africa.
Okay.
Colonialism ended in Africa, period. The only colonial problem in Africa right now is Western Sahara, and the colonizer right now that they are struggling against is Morocco.
Okay, and that goes to your distinction, decolonization 1, decolonization 2. I was going to ask a question there about words, about terminology here, because you're saying you're not interested, you don't want to engage with coloniality as a term, but are there other terms you find useful? Do you find imperialism a useful concept? Do you find yeah.
Let me now use that to say a little bit about agency.
Please do.
As you and I are speaking, and please, I hope members of the audience go out, and if they don't know, and if they know, I hope they can affirm what I am saying. Qatar, UAE, China, South Korea, where else? Turkey. They are all now buying up land in Africa. And one African country, I will not name it, okay, actually said to prospective buyers, if those people are giving you too many impossible conditions, come to us, we'll give you the land for free. So I wrote to my friends, 50 years down the road, our grandchildren will be writing about decolonizing Chinese, whatever in Africa right now. But what they will not realize is that these are Africans making the deals. These are Africans giving land to Russia now for a military base, in Somalia, in Eritrea. These are Africans giving land to China for a military base in Djibouti. What part of colonialism is that, if I may ask?
And you don't find the concept of neocolonialism useful there? Oh,
as I have just said, there is no one concept of neocolonialism. Again, we are scholars. So if you have an Obafemi Awolowo disputing that definition of neocolonialism, I would like to have people argue with him and show why he's wrong. There is no one royal road to any concept. So let people come up with their rejoinders.
Okay, great. I mean, I'm gonna move on to more questions. We could keep talking about that one for a long time. Someone asks, I was wondering what you would say to a reading of your charge as being more against nativism and essentialism rather than decoloniality, brackets, as a lens to study and identify extreme power inequalities. And then there's a long sentence. I'm not going to read it because I think it's too confusing to read out. But what would you say about what would you say to the charge that your proposals are more against nativism and essentialism rather than the idea of decoloniality? But I mean, I think you would accept that.
No, I won't, because I don't know what decoloniality has to do with any of this.
Okay.
I just don't see it.
No, I mean, I understand what you're doing there. And I think I understand why you don't want to kind of go onto that terrain. On the other hand, I suppose from a kind of the sort of social context in which we have this discussion, it's the kind of prominent framework under which these discussions about decolonization are happening, certainly in universities. And so I suppose it's sort of.
Let me defer to you for a minute, okay?
No, please don't. I don't at all
want
no,
because I think, part of what I do in the book is to say that we don't even have a firm grip on what decolonization is. And I mentioned a particular famous thinker. In just one paper of his, I identified 4 different incompatible senses of decolonization. Now, if you're working with such a fuzzy concept, how is that supposed to aid reflection? How is that supposed to lead to clear analysis? On one hand, you want to decolonize the university. So I ask you, what will a decolonized university look like after it? On the other hand, you said that, you got to decolonize because you want to fight neoliberalism. What has neoliberalism got to do with colonialism? Neoliberalism is a global movement. And it does not even leave out the so-called ex-colonizers. Welcome to Spain, welcome to Portugal, welcome to Britain, welcome to Italy. Especially after 2008. And before then, for a country like Italy, before the European Union, came together. Again, please don't let us talk as if Africa is different from other places. As we are speaking, young people are dying in Thailand trying to overthrow a god king. Young people are doing exactly the same thing as Eswatini. Young people in Hong Kong were defending the same liberal principles that they only got in 1997 when the British were leaving. They did not say that these are white ideas, and they are giving their lives and going to jail fighting the Chinese hegemon in order for them to preserve those freedoms. And then we're just writing all this stuff about how, this all neo-imperialist, whatever it is. Please, let's get on the ground. That's my point. And that's what I've done in the book. Everybody says liberal democracy doesn't work in Africa. Ghana has had, since 1994, exchanges of different parties and government and so on and so forth. In Malawi 2 years ago, the Supreme Court, denied a presidential election. We're making progress, I'm sorry.
So you're saying there that work, that kind of work around democracy and sovereignty of different sort of sorts is important, but you don't want to think of it as decolonizing. I'm clarifying.
Exactly, yeah, because for me, that was what people did when they won independence. And then their leaders abandoned, those goals, went into military rule, one-party rule. Nkrumah became a Sahara, and so on and so forth. But ordinary people never gave up on the importance of their subjectivity, of being in control of their lives, of choosing the government that will rule them. Then we saw it in the Arab-African Spring, starting 2010. What's decolonizing about that? Where's colonialism in all that?
You're answering the questions here, not me.
Oh no, but that's what I'm saying.
No, yeah.
I'm just asking, rhetorically, that our people, when they form labor movements, which the colonizers, as part of their preemption of modernity, they did not allow Africans to organize according to work. They forced Africans to organize according to ethnicity. And we know that in the history of the working class movement in Europe, the beginnings of capitalism and so on and so forth, people also started organizing in all those cities according to where they came from, and eventually made the transition to organizing about their work.
On that point of about capitalism, I mean, first of all, there's a question in the chat saying, what about economic decolonization? Is that not how being dependent economically due to colonial decisions on export crops and transport and these kinds of material questions, is that not a legacy of colonialism that should be kind of treated as such? And I've also got a question about how you figure capitalism more broadly in your work. In this text, in this book, you want to disarticulate colonialism and capitalism somewhat. I don't know how far that claim goes.
Because colonialism did not allow capitalism to develop in the continent.
Can you say a bit more? Can you say a bit more what you mean there? Because I think that to a certain extent, I would say the kind of, it depends there what you mean by capitalism. In the sense that, I mean, the kind of motives of, I think there would be general. Would you not agree with me that the motives of most all colonial kind of endeavors in Africa as elsewhere were profit driven?
Oh no, I'm not saying that capitalism was not a motive that led them there. I'm saying that, they did not allow Africans to develop, to be part of capitalism and compete with them. They destroyed African economies. They burnt plantations in Cameroon. The French burnt plantations in Cameroon so that they would not be able to compete with French principals. The British, the settlers in Kenya, forbade Kenyans, native Kenyans, from growing tea so that they will not compete with their conglomerates. How do you read that as the British now developing capitalism in Kenya?
No, I see what you mean then. I understand that. You mean, but I suppose that is the development of a capitalism, but kind of delineating who is allowed to be the capitalist.
Yes. And Africans, after independence, Kenya went capitalist. Okay. Cote d'Ivoire went capitalist. Nigeria's went mixed up economy. They call it mixed economy. It's mixed up economy. Okay. Tanzania went socialist. Again, African agency on full display.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to end with one last question on that note, which is about African agencies. So someone says, I'd like to hear more about how you think African agencies should be deployed in the current age. So with that sort of big question, do you have any closing thoughts?
Oh no, African agency is being deployed every day. Unfortunately, in many negative ways, people are voting with their food, you know, but more importantly, the kind of strenuousness with which ordinary Africans are defending, and I mean defending, their so-called Europe-inspired individual rights in the continent, extending now to same-sex rights and so on and so forth, gives me cause for hope.